I smiled at them every morning. That is the thing I have never been able to explain to anyone who was not there, who did not understand what that occupation felt like from the inside, what it cost to arrange your face into something warm and cooperative, while your mind was running calculations that would have gotten every person in that building killed if any one of those men had been paying closer attention. I smiled at Hauptmann Dieter Scholl every single morning for 2 years and 4 months, and I meant none of it, and I meant all of it simultaneously, because the smile was not for him. It was never for him. It was for the children behind the doors he never thought to open, the children in the rooms he walked past without curiosity, because I had made myself so useful and so transparent and so completely what he needed me to be that the idea of looking past me for something hidden never once formed itself into a coherent thought in his mind. That is the work I did. Not the forging of documents, though I did that. Not the bribing of officials, though I did that also. The primary work, the work that held everything else together, was the daily construction of a version of myself that those men could see completely, and therefore never truly see at all. My name is Sister Agata Wurzbicka, and I was 34 years old when the Germans occupied Lvov in 1941 and transformed the orphanage attached to our convent into a registration and processing facility for displaced children. And what I did inside that facility across the following 2 years and 4 months saved 431 children and required me to become, in certain essential ways, a person I had never imagined being. I have spent the 30 years since deciding whether that person was a betrayal of my vows or the fullest expression of them. I have settled on the fullest expression. It took a long time to settle there, and I am not certain the settling is entirely complete even now. You need to understand what the orphanage was before the occupation transformed it, because what it became only makes full sense against what it had been. The orphanage of St. Joseph had operated under the care of our convent since 1887, a large 3-story building adjacent to the convent grounds in the Lichiko district of Lvov, which had housed at any given time between 60 and 120 children, ranging in age from infancy to 16. I had worked there since my 4th year in the convent, first in the nursery, and then, as my organizational abilities became apparent to our Mother Superior, in the administrative office, where I maintained the records, the correspondence, the supply requisitions, and the relationships with municipal authorities that kept the institution functioning. I was good at this work, in the way that some people are good at things that require holding many variables simultaneously in mind, without losing track of any of them. I had a memory for detail that the other sisters occasionally found unnerving, and that I had learned early to deploy quietly rather than conspicuously, because conspicuous competence in women tends to make the wrong people nervous. When the Germans arrived and assessed the building in the autumn of 1941, they saw a large, well-organized facility with existing administrative infrastructure and an established relationship with the municipal records office, and they decided it would serve their purposes as a registration and processing point for the displaced and orphaned children flooding into Lvov from the surrounding region. Their purposes were not my purposes. Their registration was not my registration. What they intended was to document the children according to racial and ethnic categories that would determine their subsequent fates. Fates that ranged from placement with approved families to labor assignment to outcomes I will not describe in detail, because the details are known to history, and what is known to history does not need me to repeat it, and what I lived through does not need me to make it more concrete than it already is in my memory every single night. What I intended, from the moment Hauptmann Scholl walked through the doors of St. Joseph and told me that the facility would now operate under German administrative authority, and that my cooperation was expected and would be rewarded, was to place myself so firmly at the center of his operation that I could determine what that operation actually did, regardless of what it was officially supposed to do. I told Scholl that I was grateful for the structure that German administration would bring to what had been a chronically underfunded and chaotically organized institution. I told him this in the German I had learned from a German speaking sister at the convent, and which I had been quietly perfecting for the 3 months between the German invasion and this first meeting, because I had understood from the first day of the occupation that German would be the language of survival, and I was not a woman who waited for survival to become urgent before preparing for it. Scholl was pleased by my German, and more pleased by my attitude, and most pleased by the fact that I immediately produced organized filing systems and clear records and efficient processes that made his administrative responsibilities significantly less burdensome. Men like Scholl, I had understood within the first week, were not ideologically driven in the way that their superiors were. They were bureaucratically driven. They wanted their paperwork correct and their reports complete, and their superiors satisfied, and their own days as frictionless as possible. I made myself the instrument of all of those desires, and in doing so, I made myself indispensable in a way that gave me access to everything. The first child I saved was a girl of 7 named Rivka, which told anyone who knew anything about WAV in 1941 everything about the danger she was in. She arrived at St. Joseph in November of that year, brought by a neighbor who had found her hiding in a cellar after her family had been taken. She was small and dark-haired and completely silent, the silence of a child who has learned that sound is dangerous. And when school's clerk began the intake process, I watched the clerk's face as he looked at the registration form, and I understood in that moment that the system I was embedded in was going to kill this child through paperwork before it killed her through anything else. I excused myself to retrieve a file from the back office, and I took the intake form with me, and I did not return it. What I returned with was a different form, a form on which Rivka had become Maria Kowalczyk, age 7, Catholic, parents deceased in a typhus outbreak in Reschau, no surviving relatives, no identifying documentation because the documentation had been lost with the family home. I had prepared 17 such forms in advance because I had understood from the first week that this moment would come, and that when it came, I would have approximately 90 seconds to respond to it. Scholl's clerk processed Maria Kowalczyk without question because the form was correct and the filing was impeccable, and the woman who had produced it was the most reliable administrator in the building. Rivka left St. Joseph 3 weeks later with a Catholic family in the Podkarpachi region, whose name I will not record here even now, because some protections do not expire. Over the following 2 years and 3 months, I developed the operation with the same methodical patience I had brought to every administrative challenge of my life, which is to say, completely and without shortcuts, and with a constant awareness of every variable that could compromise the whole. I was not working alone. I want to be clear about this, because the stories that have been told about this period sometimes compress what was a network into a single person, and single persons do not save 431 children. Sister Dominica in our convent forged the baptismal records with a steadiness of hand I could not have matched. A printer named Henryk Malinowski produced the identity documents in a back room of his shop on Akademika Street. A network of Catholic families across the Podkarpacia, the Lublin region, and into the Krakow district received children and integrated them into their households and maintained the fiction that these children had always been there. A lawyer named Dr. Zygmunt Price managed the legal documentation when legal documentation was required. And there were others, farmers and teachers and priests and ordinary people who had decided, each in their own way, that this was the work available to them, and they would do it. My role was the center of the network because my position gave me something no one else had, which was legitimate daily access to the German administrative apparatus and the ability to move children through that apparatus in ways that left no trace of what they actually were or where they were actually going. I processed the paperwork. I managed the schedule of inspections in ways that ensured certain rooms were empty or certain files were inaccessible on the days when thoroughness might have been catastrophic. I cultivated relationships with 3 other German officers who rotated through the facility, learning what each of them needed from their administrative environment and providing it so consistently that my presence became something they relied on rather than examined. One of them, a lieutenant named Brandt, who was 24 years old and clearly terrified of everything, I helped process his personal correspondence home because his written German was poor and he was ashamed of it. And in return for this, I had in him a source of advance warning about inspections and administrative changes that proved valuable on at least 6 occasions. The moment that came closest to ending everything was in March 1943. A Gestapo officer named Kessler arrived at St. Joseph for what was described as a routine audit of child registration records. Kessler was not like Scholl or Brandt. Kessler was the ideologically driven variety, the kind who looked at paperwork not to confirm that it was correct, but to find what it was concealing. He spent 4 hours in the records room, and I sat across the table from him for all 4 of those hours, answering his questions with the steady patience of a woman who had nothing to conceal. Which is to say, I answered with the patience of a woman who had been practicing having nothing to conceal for 2 years, until the practice had become indistinguishable from the reality. He found two inconsistencies in the filing system, genuine inconsistencies that existed because the system was managing two parallel sets of records simultaneously, and the strain of that occasionally produced small errors. I explained both inconsistencies with bureaucratic explanations that were plausible and detailed, and which I had prepared in advance, because I had understood from the beginning of the operation that Kessler, or someone like Kessler, would eventually appear, and that the explanation needed to be ready before the question was asked. He accepted both explanations. He left at 5 in the afternoon. I went to the convent chapel, and I sat in the dark for 2 hours, and I did not pray in any formal sense. I simply sat and let my body understand that it had survived something and needed to register that survival before it could continue. The liberation of Lvov came in July 1944, when Soviet forces moved through the city and the German administration collapsed with a speed that surprised everyone, including, I think, the Germans themselves. Scholl left on a Tuesday morning without saying anything to me, which I found afterward both completely predictable and faintly absurd. That after 2 years and 4 months of daily interaction, the ending was simply an absence where a presence had been. I stood in the administrative office of St. Joseph on the morning of Wednesday, the 26th of July, 1944, and I looked at the filing cabinets, and I spent the next 4 hours removing and destroying every document that connected the German administrative operation to the facility. And then I spent the following 4 hours restoring and organizing every record that pertained to the children who had passed through my hands across those 2 years and 4 months, because those records were the only continuous thread connecting 431 children to the identities they had been given, and to the families who had received them, and to the possibility of eventually finding each other again when the world settled into something stable enough to search in. 431 children. I have the number memorized in the way you memorize things that are not information, but are instead the measure of why you did what you did, and whether it was enough. It was not enough. There were children I could not reach, children who arrived after the network's capacity was already stretched beyond what I could manage safely, children whose circumstances did not fit the pathways I had built, children I watched leave St. Joseph in directions I could not redirect, and whose fates I have carried in the particular way you carry the things you could not change, but cannot stop turning over. 431 is the number I saved. It is a large number. It has never felt large enough. I do not think it was supposed to feel large enough. I think the insufficiency is part of what the work costs you, and that accepting the cost without letting it cancel the achievement is the discipline that the work demands, even after the work is finished. I smiled at Hauptmann Dieter Scholl every morning for 2 years and 4 months, and every evening I knelt in the convent chapel, and I accounted for the day, and I asked for the steadiness to do it again tomorrow. And the steadiness always came, not because I was exceptional, but because 431 children needed it to come, And need, in my experience, is the most reliable source of strength that exists in this world or any other.